This week we're going to be in the studio, and our model Hope is going to be giving us some librarian poses. So I thought it was time to try some ink and wash. Indian ink, undiluted, a sharpened stick used to draw lines with the undiluted ink, and then a piece of sponge and some wash, some diluted ink, to put in some tone, some shadow, and contrast. So I have a reference photograph of a figure with some books, and I'm going to begin just with a line drawing, an outline of this woman holding a pile of books. The stick that I'm using is a piece of willow. I've sharpened it, and because I'm doing a bit of an outline to a face, I can find parts of this stick which are thin and will give me a slightly more delicate line. I can also pick up more ink, particularly at the beginning. You'll see when I start a line, there's quite a lot of ink there. But you'll also see that as I continue to draw, the ink runs out. And so the marks that I make are less inky and perhaps less likely to get a blob. And there you see I can actually make some quite grey marks, or I can pick up ink elsewhere. So for example, I would like to give this young woman some features. So I'm taking ink from what's already there. I'm letting some of the ink dry out on the stick. And with features in particular, because I'm trying to do something a little bit more delicate, I might not even, I might not do a continuous line. I might put a more broken mark. But all of that is by way of helping, I suppose, control the ink. But actually, I think one of the great things about working with ink and a sharpened stick is that you don't have very much control. And that is pretty liberating, and it can often result in, quite dynamic, exciting drawings that surprise the artist and therefore probably surprise the viewer, have some interest for the viewer. That line's wrong, so I've just changed it. And then, because we're dealing with libraries and books, I need to find a way of laying down some simple lines. So I've got this woman is carrying a whole stack of books. We'll get Hope to give us some poses on Monday, which will be perhaps a bit like this, with that that idea of someone either reading books or stacking books, working with books, and so on. Some figures that will be appropriate to your library settings that you were able to gather last week in the Fine Art Library. So that's more or less what I do with my stick. So that's essentially drawing lines. Then I'm going to let that dry, and I'm going to take my sponge and look with my eyes half closed and introduce a pattern of tone or value to these lines, so that I can create a more three-dimensional effect, and also so that I can add a certain amount of drama to my drawing. So that's more or less dry. I put it onto a heater for a few minutes to speed the process up. Sometimes bits of ink that are dry are shiny, and so they still look wet. But I have my wash, and I've got a sharpish piece of sponge, and that's going to give me a block of tone. The sponge is as, I suppose, as varied as the stick, in that you don't quite know what sort of mark you're going to get, but a sharpened piece of sponge like this will mean that you can move it around and get thin and thick shapes. So I see that some of that ink is still wet, so I'm picking up some of the wet bits with the wash, but mainly the wash is allowing me to block in tone. So our model has got dark hair, and she's got some nice shadows on the side of her face and on her neck. So as well as giving her dark clothing, I'm using some of the sharp bits of sponge just to get some shadows on that figure. And occasionally, as I say, I'm picking up bits of the not dry ink from the line drawing. And here with these books, I think I want to make a little, perhaps create some of the shadows. So this is a very quick thing to do. There's a nice bit of rough sponge at one part of my piece of sponge, and I'm using that to put down some slightly more textured marks. And I'm pleased actually that I can pick up some wet ink, because I think it's helpful if her clothing is a bit darker and her hair was a bit darker. So that's very quick to do. I've looked with my eyes half closed. I've seen the pattern of shadow and tone that I want to apply, and I've done it, in a minute. So I'm going to try a second approach. That was the line first and then the wash. I'm going to try a second approach where I put down the wash first. So I have a second reference photo of a girl with books, and starting with the sponge and the wash, I'm looking with my eyes half closed at my subject, and I'm laying down some shapes, some dark shapes. So my model has got dark hair, which is very helpful. So I can put down those shapes. I'm fairly confident about them. And then there are some shadows on her neck. She's got a stripy top on. So this is inevitably a less easy approach, actually, or that is to say, an approach in which it's less easy to be exact. So what I'm laying down really are some provisional shapes. But I look, as I say, with my eyes half closed, and in that way I can discern where the darker areas are. And I'm trying to do shapes. I mean, that I just did a line there when I said that, but it was a long, thin shape. That is to say, I'm trying to do shapes rather than outlines. But a slight interruption to my recording there, which has meant that my wash has dried a bit, but I just want to do a tiny bit more to this face. And I'll let it dry. And as I've been saying, this is an approximate provisional way of drawing. I'm applying some tone, but because I'm using this Should I do a little bit more? Let's go over and just make it a little bit stronger. Since I'm using this piece of sponge, it's inevitably going to be a little bit approximate, a little bit provisional. I don't want to do too much of an outline. Really what I want to do is lay down some shapes, some provisional shapes that I'll then draw into. So let's let that dry. So I've let that dry on the heater, and I'm back to my sharpened stick and my pot of undiluted ink. And although I've laid out these shapes, which are, as I said, a provisional version of my subject, I'm going to redraw them using this line. So if you like, there won't necessarily be a registration, a perfect registration between the shapes, the tonal shapes that I laid down and the lines that I lay on top. And if there isn't a perfect registration, I'll produce a drawing with much more depth to it, because it that sort of layering quality of the line and the tone, and I'm going to run out of time, I'm not going to finish this in time. The layering quality will be what is best seen. So we'll do that